What is the purpose of school? This question seems strange and irritating since the institution of school obviously matters in our everyday life. The fact that there is a school, that there should be a school, is part of our normality. Sure, we all once went to school, sometimes more, sometimes less willingly. Some of us have loved school, others have hated it. And we all have survived this institution somehow. However, school itself, school as an institution, the compulsory attendance of school is seldom discussed. We usually have neither a room nor a language for those questions. School? Who? How? What? Why? For what purpose? Nobody prevents us from asking such questions as well. And then there are situations when doubt about this whole system arises in us, doubt about the sense, the value of this institution. We live in times that almost force alike questions on us. In the face of a corona pandemic, the strangest things happen. Suddenly, everyday life functions more or less well, more or less relaxed, without children and young people going to a certain building every day, without them gathering in certain groups and classes, without them studying a certain subject at a set time in the physical presence of a teacher. This situation sheds light on a previous normality that we regarded as seemingly unchangeable, almost God-given. Some things now become possible that previously seemed even unthinkable. However, in this light, many things become visible as shadows. For example, the limits of digital learning in the midst of all the opportunities and necessity. For example, the revelation that school is often a protective space for children and young people, protection often from their own families. For example, the realization that unequal opportunities due to the family background cannot be overcome by social measurements like teaching and qualifications, but those offers can deal with this inequality in a productive manner. School as a safe haven and an opportunity for greater equity, and to carry the novelty too far. Many students express the desire to finally be allowed to go back to school. School as a place of longing, a seemingly strange desire, which above all sheds light on the generally privileged situation of growing up in economically highly developed societies. The appearing unfamiliarity of a crisis makes visible the strengths, but also the weakness of our previous normality. They demand us to think anew and differently about what school is actually supposed to do. Traditionally, the meaning of school as an institution has been the subject of controversial debates. Above all, the functions of qualification, integration, enculturation, and selection can be distinguished. Those functions justify and give significance to the institution. So far, so good. Let us take a closer look at the core statements of the functions mentioned. Qualification is about the fit between school and the economy, meaning it is about the reproduction and further development of economic conditions via the teaching of appropriate, professionally relevant skills. This happens through instruction and secondary socialization at school, behavioral patterns that conform to society, such as reliability, punctuality, and so on. Integration also means focusing on a certain form of fit. But in this case, it does not only touch the economic, but the political dimension of society. School imparts a framework of values that defines the boundaries of speech and action marked out by society. Enculturation focuses on the connection of the individual to the cultural orders of society. Literacy, language interpretation, and judgment skills are understood as necessary elements for arriving in society as a cultural being. And finally, the logic of selection that inherently shapes the logic of schooling is clear to us. Evaluation, grades, and degrees, which are supposed to say something about our knowledge and ability, about our acquired skills. Overall, it is about fitting, making fit through school. Many actors in the World Education Fellowship had the idea that changing the normality of growing up process is actually only possible by founding a new, an alternative form of institution. By finding a radical answer to the question of school's purpose. Yes, school has something to do with fitting in, but the alternative educators were concerned with making fit for a particular way of life, an idea that was usually associated with the notion of child-centered pedagogy. One example of alternative school design is closely associated with the University of Jena on the one hand, and the World Education Fellowship on the other. As is well known, the World Education Fellowship had been founded 100 years ago as the New Education Fellowship. The who's who of alternative pedagogy debated at major conferences of the 1920s. One congress of the New Education Fellowship was held in Locarno in 1927. There, Peter Peterson presented his school model, which, influenced by his academic background, was named Jena Plan. Peterson taught philosophy of education at the University of Jena and at the same time ran a school that was attached to the university. In this alternative school, he tried to develop a child-centered pedagogy. The new concept saw the teacher as a learning companion and promoter of children's talents. School itself was conceived as a place of structured living together. Teaching in a narrow sense was only one element alongside others. Peterson's Jena-Plan school model exemplifies the search for alternative functions of school in the face of a changing society. Peterson's Jena-Plan stands for creating a school concept that highlights learning paths, learning needs, and learning talents of children and young people. The constructive idea that school should be an alternative place for living and working together, following rules of mutual recognition, is still an important impulse for today. In times of social distancing, those impulses threw a different light on the value of personal encounters. Asking about the characteristics of school normality today, against the background of impulses just mentioned, we do not yet get clear answers, but rather a set of tentative questions. If we look more closely at the contours of normality today, we begin to doubt to a new extent. Must that, what is, really be the exact way we find it? This question, this type of question, is not new. It has accompanied a modern pedagogy, spoken from a Western European perspective, at least since the 18th century. Since that very time, the question of a right form of teaching and schooling has become a permanent subject of reformatory debates. To put it bluntly, since the Enlightenment, from a Western European perspective, we have been in the mode of permanent reformatory debates. In all of this, I'm aware that in times of post-colonial and decolonial objections, social notions of normality above all are under scrutiny, and rightly so. And when we look at schools as the essential institution of society, questions of overt and covert privilege and discrimination must be addressed in a new and frank way. This is not what the founders of a World Education Fellowship usually had in mind. Following Paulo Freire or bell hooks, we need to change and broaden our view in this sense. The Western European perspective must itself put to the test. The following considerations are formulated from a Western European perspective, which tries to connect the child-centered orientation of pedagogy and the fundamental orientation towards human dignity. But self-critical skepticism with regard to the relativity of one's own speaking position was one of the preconditions of the following considerations. The discussion of normality, including the norm-giving power and function of school, has taken on a new dynamic in the second half of the 20th century and at the beginning of the 21st century. Even if other quite different perspectives could certainly be considered of particular importance, three aspects above all seem to determine today's thinking about the school system. The global, the postcolonial, and the digital. The far-reaching, unanswered questions are, do those keywords, global, postcolonial, digital, shape today's normality quite significantly? Should they? What does this mean for the functional definition of school as such? Can school still be thought of today while ignoring these keywords? Can school still function today while ignoring them? And above all, what does this mean in concrete terms? The experience of a fundamental paradox moves into the center of thinking about the function of school. The paradox is about today's perception of what is normal for our comprehension of the human condition. The norms from the reality that put pressure on the school system. On the one hand, the absolute value and liability of universality and inclusion are normal. But on the other hand, at the same time, the absolute value and liability of diversity and heterogeneity are normal. Both sides stand for challenges an individual has to overcome during their construction of a self-image, the social ego. However, school is an essential context for this process. The integration of different perspectives only succeeds with the greatest effort. However, both challenges together can hardly be sorted out in our minds, in our understanding. This is also a challenge to adequately determine the function of school. We face the task of simultaneously understanding ourselves as one and as different when regarding our relationship between the self and the other, or at least we should do. In cultural studies terms, the meaning and distinctiveness of universality and heterogeneity have been developed into seemingly opposing questions of normality. In reality, however, they are complementary. To this end, two theoretical framings have been created, each containing its own conception of essential learning challenges. This also touches upon the function of all organized and unorganized teaching. Both theoretical frameworks carry in them a perspective of what a person today should learn primarily if they want to unfold their humanity. Both frameworks put normality to the test and thus also test the functionality of a system like school. One questioning of normality can be described with the keyword global. It builds up upon the insight that we have to ask for fundamental rights for all human beings in a new quality today. It is about the question of universal equality for all human beings. Conversely, It means addressing the deficits, for example, in participation opportunities, that the field of universal and basic human rights reveals. Here, diversity becomes a central problem. For example, when thinking about access requirements to education and educational opportunities. In this perspective, justice and unredeemed equality are the fundamental questions. The UNESCO program Education for All represents a perspective that highlights participation through inclusion. Ultimately, the elementary rights of human beings can only be discussed and justified globally. This is especially true because otherwise one might look for gateways to deny certain groups their humanity or to try to distinguish between superior and inferior forms of humanity. In this context, difference is problematic, or at least plays a secondary role. Global is about the orientation towards and realization of equal rights for all. It is about searching for a practical implementation of equalizing human rights as participation rights and development opportunities, especially in the field of education and school. This standpoint is met with justified objections. It makes sense to use the keyword post-colonial for the fundamental objection against universalistic and equalizing tendency. This is true even though it may be a systematization that is perceived as problematic. But from this perspective, emphasizing diversity is not a problem. Quite the contrary. It means honoring a new necessary disorder of thought. Critical thinking here arises from the awareness of the unjust, problematic differences. It is about the differences that follow from exclusion and marginalization due to power hierarchies and violence. It is about the denial of recognition of diversity. The manifold forms of non-recognition cover a wide field, from cultural attributions in the mode of generalization to concrete forms of material oppression and exploitation. It is about a distrust of everything universal, and thus also global attributions of the human condition. The suspicion is that universal statements serve above all to disguise and camouflage existent power structures and mechanisms of oppression, especially regarding forms of exclusion and exploitation. Post-colonial perspectives call for a sensitivity for heterogeneous life worlds as well as for non-colonial, non-paternalistic partisanship for certain groups of people. Self-critical empathy, listening, and insight into the relations and conditions of one's own understanding are possible cornerstones for an according understanding of learning. Becoming aware of and at least occasionally speaking out. One's own position and perspective then becomes the precondition of all speech, thought, and action. Theoretically, one may quickly think that this does not necessarily have to contradict core concerns of global learning. In practice, the simultaneity of different kinds of respect quickly comes up against the limits of understanding, of being able to speak and being told to be silent, of taking sides and not being able to adopt marginalized positions, at least for me. Regarding the functional description of school, one according conclusion could be, if we talk about normality today with regard to the school system, then the tension between global and post-colonial concerns must be inscribed in it. Whether this inscription can be translated into action is a great challenge. Whether and how it can succeed is a question of attentiveness and sensitivity concerning both manners and learning content in schools. In any case, the ability to tolerate ambiguity and contradiction should be at the focus of attention. However, this seems to be hardly compatible with social reproduction, especially in economic or political terms. The reason for this is that society cannot work with increased uncertainty. On the contrary, society is dependent on minimizing this uncertainty. This also applies to school. A third aspect that interlocks the two content-related cultural dimensions of global and post-colonial is indicated by the keyword digital. It is one thing to ask for opportunities and technical possibilities of digitization and of digitalization in terms of instruments. In this technical respect, there is undoubtedly great potential for development. This is blithely demanded and also established in terms of the digitalization of school. However, the examination of digitalization only then becomes pedagogically relevant in a different sense. Digitalization as digital transformation becomes pedagogical when it is not only seen as an instrument or technology. It is about understanding digital transformation as something that determines all preconditions and forms of learning today. Rather, it is a matter of culturally redefining the self-relationship and self-understanding of a human being as a learner. What does it mean that learning today is co-determined by the digital? That worlds of reality drift apart in the digital horizon? That talking of the reality becomes virtually contourless? What is the impact of the digital on our basic understanding of human beings as learners, and what is its impact on education? This is not just about technical possibilities and their implementation, but rather about the question of the extent to which the digital transformation culturally shapes and changes people's learning. and the function of schools. The digital as the abolition of the boundaries of reality also lead to a fundamental change in the relationship between the school system and its environment. Then the question arises as to what actually remains of reality, and with regard to school, how this image of reality changes, annuls, negates, or readjusts the function of school. This leads to a whole series of follow-up questions. In addition, how does this connect to the motives of a global and postcolonial? To what extent do universality and heterogeneity play out in the digital? Or put it differently, do not universality and heterogeneity have new quality in the digital? What does it mean to be human in the digital, and how does the digital transformation change our conception of the human? And how does this reshape the school system? Thus, when we ask about normality in the pedagogical realm today, the three aspects of the global, the postcolonial, and the digital impose perspectives that put the school system to the test. More questions, fewer answers. So it seems to me, significant challenges from the background. Who defines the rules of normality and how? Who asserts what in our social and societal game of comprehension? And by what means and in which kind of ways? In this context, arranging and rearranging semantic fields, like talking about school, is crucial. For example, what is considered normal and self-evident in the pedagogical field, and what is not? School? Who? How? What? Why? Wherefore? For which purpose? If we do not ask again and again what school as an institution is for, what makes it tick, where its indispensable achievements but also its limits lie, we will not do justice. Justice to children and young people, to parents and society, and ultimately and above all, to ourselves. There may be no simple, straightforward, and unambiguous answers. Nevertheless, it is necessary to ask the question, why school, again and again, and thus to constantly review it. Otherwise, we will not only remain stupid, we might hide that, but above all, mute. And false silence can ring quite loudly.